The wind doesn't just blow in the Wyoming territory. It howls like a lonely spirit looking for a home. In 1885, a woman's survival depended on the strength of her spirit or the shadow of the man standing beside her. Sarah Winslow had lost everything to a silver mine collapse in the east. Now she stood on a frozen train platform, looking at a man dressed in animal hides and tattered wool. They called him Ragged Caleb. He was a man of the dirt and the stone, or so it seemed. She married him out of desperation, never imagining that his calloused hands held the keys to a kingdom hidden above the clouds.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Before we journey into the high peaks of the Old West, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us keep these forgotten stories of love and redemption alive. Now, let us step back in time to 1885.
The train whistle sounded like a funeral dirge as it pulled away from the Laramie station. Sarah Winslow stood on the wooden planks, clutching the handle of her single trunk. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. Winter wasn't just coming, it was already here. In 1885, the West was no place for a woman alone. Without a husband or a family, the law of the land was harsh. The local marshal had been clear. She couldn't stay in the boarding house without a means of support. She had two choices. She could return to the poverty of the city, or she could accept the proposal of the man standing at the edge of the platform. His name was Caleb Vance. To the townspeople, he was a ghost. He came down from the mountains twice a year to trade furs for salt and iron. He wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide, and his beard was a wild thicket of chestnut hair. His eyes, however, were different. They weren't the eyes of a brute. They were deep, observant, and strangely calm. "I have a cabin," Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "It is a long walk. It is cold, but you will be safe. You will be respected." Sarah looked at her thin leather shoes and then at the towering, jagged peaks of the Wind River Range. She didn't know this man. In town, they whispered that he lived in a dugout like an animal, surviving on roots and grit. He looked like a man who didn't own a single gold coin. But Sarah saw no malice in him. She saw a quiet strength that she lacked. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took his. The local circuit judge performed the ceremony in less than 5 minutes. No flowers, no music, just two strangers binding their lives together to survive the frost. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Caleb hoisted Sarah's heavy trunk onto his broad shoulders as if it weighed nothing at all. He didn't head toward the main road or the logging camps. Instead, he pointed toward the highest, most forbidden ridge in the territory. "The path is narrow, Sarah," he whispered. "Keep your eyes on my tracks. Do not look back." As they stepped off the trail and into the thick, dark timber, the last lights of the town vanished. Sarah realized with a shiver that she wasn't just following a stranger into the woods, she was disappearing from the world entirely.
The shadows of the towering pines swallowed them whole. The air turned sharp, smelling of damp earth and ancient sap. For the first hour, the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of Caleb's heavy boots breaking the crust of the early autumn frost. Sarah followed behind, her breath coming in short, ragged puffs of white mist. In the late 19th century, the mountains were more than just scenery. They were a barrier that demanded a toll of sweat and endurance. For a woman raised in the structured streets of the East, the silence of the Wyoming wilderness was deafening. There were no carriage wheels, no clanging bells, and no voices. There was only the great silence. Caleb moved with a strange, fluid grace for a man of his size. He didn't speak, but every few minutes he would pause, tilting his head to listen. He wasn't looking for danger, he was reading the mountain. This was a vital skill for the mountain men of 1885. To them, a snap of a twig or the sudden flight of a mountain jay told a story of what lay ahead. "Wait," Caleb whispered, raising a hand. Sarah froze, her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked around, expecting to see a predator or a rival traveler. Instead, Caleb knelt by a small frozen stream. He didn't pull a weapon, he pulled a small wooden cup from his pack and broke the thin ice. "Drink," he said, handing it to her. "The high air thins the blood. If you don't hydrate, the mountain sickness will take your legs before the sun sets." This was the educational reality of high-altitude survival. Sarah took the cup, her fingers brushing his. His skin was like leather, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. As she drank the icy water, she noticed the way he looked at the peaks. It wasn't the look of a man who was struggling to survive. It was the look of a man who was home. As they climbed higher, the terrain became more treacherous. The dirt path gave way to slick granite shelves and narrow ledges that overlooked dizzying drops. Sarah's fear began to rise, a cold knot in her stomach. She looked at Caleb's tattered, mud-stained clothes and felt a pang of guilt. She had judged him for his poverty, but out here, his knowledge was worth more than all the banknotes in Laramie. Just as the last sliver of twilight faded, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of a heavy storm. Caleb stopped in front of a massive rock overhang. "We stop here," he announced. Sarah looked around. There was no cabin, no fire, just the dark, cold stone. "Where is your home, Caleb?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling. Caleb looked up at the stars beginning to peek through the clouds. "The house is still far, Sarah, and tonight the mountain has other plans for us." The overhang was shallow, providing little more than a roof of cold granite. As the wind began to howl, Caleb didn't panic. He moved with a calculated precision that fascinated Sarah. While she huddled against her trunk, Caleb began to gather fallen branches and dry needles from the base of the surrounding subalpine firs. In the 1880s, knowing which wood to burn was a matter of life and death. Caleb selected the dead lower limbs of the hemlock, explaining quietly that they stayed dry even in high humidity. He didn't use a match. Those were expensive and unreliable in the wind. Instead, he used a small piece of flint and steel, striking them until a tiny spark caught a nest of dried moss. "The mountain speaks in 1,000 ways, Sarah," Caleb said, his face illuminated by the flickering orange glow. "The way the squirrels cache their pine nuts tells you how long the winter will be. The way the birds fly low means the pressure is dropping. If you don't learn her language, she won't let you stay." Sarah watched his hands. They were scarred and rough, yet he handled the small tinder with the delicacy of a clockmaker. As the fire grew, he pulled a handful of dried willow bark from his pouch and offered it to her. "Chew on this," he instructed. "It's bitter, but it will take the ache out of your head from the climb." This was an essential piece of frontier knowledge. Willow bark contains salicin, a natural precursor to modern aspirin. It was the medicine of the mountain man, a bridge between nature and survival. Sarah hesitated, then chewed. The bitterness was sharp, but within minutes, the throbbing behind her eyes began to fade. As they sat by the fire, the gap between their worlds seemed to narrow. Sarah looked at Caleb's tattered sleeves and then back at the fire he had built from nothing. She realized that in the city, wealth was measured by what you could buy. Out here, wealth was measured by what you knew. "Why do they call you Ragged Caleb?" Sarah asked softly. Caleb stared into the flames, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. "People see the clothes, Sarah. They don't see the man. In the valley, they think a man's worth is tied to his velvet coat. But up here, velvet won't keep you warm, and gold won't guide you home."
He reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He didn't open it to read, he simply held it with a sense of reverence. Sarah realized then that there were layers to this man that the town of Laramie could never understand. The fire began to die down, and the temperature plummeted. Caleb stood up and looked toward the jagged silhouettes of the peaks above. The secret mansion felt like a fairy tale, but as Sarah looked at the mystery in Caleb's eyes, she began to believe it might actually exist. "Rest now," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we climb to the roof of the world."
The morning didn't bring the sun. Instead, it brought a sky the color of lead and a wind that cut through wool like a straight razor. Caleb woke Sarah before the first hint of gray light touched the peaks. He didn't speak much, but his movements were urgent. He knew the signs. In the high Rockies of 1885, a late autumn storm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a wall of white that could bury a person in minutes. "The pass is only a mile up," Caleb shouted over the rising gale. "If we reach the lee side of the ridge, we can ride it out. If we stay here, we'll be under 6 feet of snow by noon." They began the ascent. The incline was steep, a brutal scramble over loose scree and frozen earth. As they climbed, the educational reality of the timberline became clear. The trees grew shorter, twisted into gnarled shapes by the constant battering of the wind, a phenomenon known as krumholtz. Beyond this point, there was no more wood for fires. There was only the rock and the sky. Halfway up the pass, the sky finally broke, not with rain, but with graupel, small icy pellets that stung the skin. Then the true snow arrived. It came in horizontal sheets, erasing the horizon. Sarah stumbled, her boots sliding on a patch of black ice. She felt the world tilt. Before she could slide toward the precipice, a hand like a vice gripped her arm. Caleb didn't pull her up with anger. He used his own body as a shield against the wind. He hauled her into a narrow cleft between 2 massive boulders. It wasn't a cave, just a temporary sanctuary, but it felt like a fortress. "We can't go forward," Sarah cried, her voice trembling with cold. "We're going to freeze, aren't we?" Caleb sat her down and did something unexpected. He opened his heavy buffalo robe and pulled her toward him, tucking her under the thick, oily fur. "Body heat is the only currency the mountain accepts right now, Sarah," he said softly. To keep her mind from the howling void outside, he began to tell her stories, not of hunting or trapping, but of the stars. He spoke of the Great Bear and the North Star, explaining how the ancient mariners and the indigenous tribes used them as a map. He spoke with the vocabulary of an educated man, a scholar hidden in the skin of a hermit. Sarah leaned her head against his chest. Beneath the tattered wool and the scent of wood smoke, she heard the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was the only thing in the world that felt solid. She realized that Caleb Vance wasn't running from life, he was building a different kind of one. As the storm roared outside, Sarah found herself no longer fearing the man she had married. She began to fear the world they had left behind.
The storm raged for hours, turning the world into a chaotic swirl of white. Inside the narrow cleft of rock, time seemed to stretch and warp. Sarah lay tucked against Caleb's side, the heavy buffalo robe acting as a barrier against the freezing death just inches away. As the wind settled into a rhythmic moan, Caleb's breathing slowed into a deep sleep, his exhaustion finally overtaking his vigilance. Sarah moved slightly to adjust her numbing legs, and as she did, Caleb's tattered coat shifted. From a hidden inner pocket, something metallic slid out and caught the dim reflected light of the snow. It wasn't the dull gray of iron or the rustic brown of a trapping tool. It was the unmistakable, brilliant glint of high-carat gold. Curiosity overcame her fear. Sarah reached out and picked up the object. It was a heavy, intricate locket, suspended by a delicate chain that seemed far too fragile for a man of the wilderness. With a trembling thumb, she clicked the latch.
Inside was not a photograph. Photography was still a luxury of the elite in 1885, but a tiny hand-painted miniature. It showed a woman in a silk gown, her hair styled in the sophisticated Gibson girl fashion of the high society East. Beside the portrait, etched into the gold, was a complex architectural drawing. It wasn't a cabin, it was a blueprint for a structure with vaulted ceilings and sprawling balconies. Sarah gasped softly. Who was this man? The town called him a pauper, yet he carried a fortune in his pocket and the dreams of an architect in his heart. In the late 19th century, many men fled to the West to bury their pasts, bankruptcies, scandals, or lost loves. They were known as remittance men or shadow seekers, individuals who traded their status for the anonymity of the frontier. Suddenly, Caleb's hand clamped gently but firmly over hers. Sarah jumped, nearly dropping the locket. He was awake, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He didn't look angry, he looked exposed. "That belongs to a life that died a long time ago," Caleb said, his voice like grinding stones. "You're not who they say you are," Sarah whispered, handing the gold back to him. "A man who carries blueprints and fine gold doesn't live in a dirt hole in the ground." Caleb took the locket and tucked it back into the darkness of his coat. "The world down there thinks beauty must be shown to be real. They build monuments to their own greed. I wanted to build something that belonged only to the mountain." He stood up, shaking the frost from his shoulders. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world of crystalline silence. The air was thin and pure, the kind of cold that felt like drinking diamonds. "Come," Caleb said, his mystery hanging between them like a veil. "The sun is rising. It's time I showed you why I brought you here."
The world after a mountain storm is a cathedral of white and blue. As Caleb and Sarah stepped out from their rocky shelter, the sun hit the fresh powder with a brilliance that was almost blinding. This phenomenon, known as snow blindness, was a constant threat to travelers in 1885. Caleb, prepared as always, took a piece of charred wood from their dead fire and smeared a thin line of black soot under Sarah's eyes. "The black absorbs the glare," he explained, his voice softening. "Without it, the light will burn your vision before noon. The mountain gives beauty, but she demands you respect her power." They began the final, grueling climb. They were now well above the clouds, moving along a narrow spine of rock that felt like the very edge of the world. To Sarah's left was a sheer drop of 1,000 feet. To her right, a wall of jagged granite. In the 19th century, such heights were rarely braved by anyone other than the most hardened long hunters or gold prospectors. Caleb led her toward a vertical cliff face that looked utterly impassable. There was no trail, no bridge, and no sign of human passage. Sarah stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. "There's nowhere left to go, Caleb. We're the dead end." Caleb didn't answer. He walked to a cluster of ancient wind-twisted cedars and pulled back a heavy curtain of frost-covered branches. Hidden behind the greenery was a miracle of frontier engineering, a series of hand-carved stone steps reinforced with heavy timber beams winding upward through a natural chimney in the rock. "In the East," Caleb said, helping her onto the first step, "men build to be seen. They build grand cathedrals and banks to show off their gold. But out here, the greatest work of a man is what he can build without disturbing the peace of the earth." As they climbed the hidden staircase, Caleb pointed out the way the stones were dry-laid, fitted together without mortar. This was an ancient technique used by stonemasons to allow the structure to shift with the freezing and thawing of the mountain. It was a lesson in resilience. If you are too rigid, the winter will break you. If you allow for movement, you will endure.
Sarah's legs burned and her lungs felt like they were filled with ice, but she didn't stop. With every step, the mystery of the man in front of her grew. He wasn't just a survivalist, he was an artist who had used the mountain as his canvas. Suddenly, the narrow passage opened up. They stepped out onto a wide, flat plateau that was invisible from the valley floor. Caleb reached out and took Sarah's hand, his grip warm and steady. "Look up, Sarah," whispered Caleb. "We aren't at the end. We're at the beginning." As Sarah looked up, she didn't see more jagged rocks or barren ice. Instead, the ground sloped downward into a hidden emerald-green bowl tucked between the peaks. It was a geological anomaly, a hanging valley protected on all sides by high ridges that acted as a shield against the brutal Wyoming winds. It's warm," Sarah whispered, unbuttoning the top of her heavy coat. She was right. The air here didn't bite. It drifted with the scent of damp moss and warm stone. Caleb led her down a winding path toward the center of the valley. As they descended, Sarah noticed steam rising from small, crystal-clear pools scattered among the rocks. In the 1880s, the discovery of geothermal activity was often the stuff of legends among mountain men. These hot springs were created by rainwater seeping deep into the Earth's crust, being heated by magma and rising back to the surface. For a pioneer, finding such a place was like finding a vein of pure gold. It meant a source of heat that never went out and water that never froze. "This is the Valley of Whispers," Caleb explained. "The steam makes a sound when the wind catches it just right. It's a microclimate, Sarah. While the rest of the territory is buried under 10 feet of snow, the ground here stays thawed. I spent 3 years searching for this spot before I laid the first stone." Sarah looked around in awe. There were plants here that shouldn't exist at this altitude, thick ferns and hardy grasses that stayed green despite the season. Caleb pointed out a patch of winter fat, a silver-colored shrub. The cattlemen in the valley would kill for this. It's high in protein and stays nutritious even in the dead of winter. It's how the elk survive the lean months. This was the educational brilliance of Caleb's hidden world. He hadn't just found a place to hide. He had found a place where nature provided everything a person needed to thrive, provided they knew how to manage the land. He showed her how he had diverted a small portion of the hot water through a series of hollowed-out log pipes. "It keeps the soil warm," he said. "I can grow root vegetables even when the blizzards are screaming over the ridge." As they walked deeper into the valley, the mist began to thin. The sun was setting, casting long golden fingers across the meadow. In the distance, Sarah saw a structure that made her heart stop. It wasn't a shack or a dugout. It was a massive silhouette of timber and glass perched on a rise of white quartz. "Is that—" Sarah started, her voice trailing off. "That is home," Caleb replied. "But before you enter those doors, the world below no longer exists."
The structure that emerged from the mountain mist was a defiance of every law of the frontier. In 1885, most settlers lived in sod houses or cramped log cabins with dirt floors and oiled paper for windows. But before Sarah stood a mansion of quartz and cedar that seemed to grow directly out of the living rock. It was 2 stories tall, with wide, sweeping eaves designed to shed the heavy mountain snow, and massive panes of glass that reflected the purple hues of the dying sun. "How?" Sarah breathed, her feet frozen in place. "The glass alone, the weight of it. How did you get this up here?" Caleb walked toward the heavy oak door. "One piece at a time, Sarah, over 5 years. I didn't use a wagon. I used a pulley system I rigged to the cliff face, and I traded high-altitude furs for the materials. People think I'm poor because I don't spend my life in their shops. I spent my life building this instead."
This was a masterpiece of passive solar design, a concept that wouldn't be formally named for decades, but was understood by master builders of the era. The house was south-facing, with thick stone walls that acted as a thermal mass. During the day, the quartz stones absorbed the sun's heat. At night, they slowly released it back into the rooms. Caleb pushed open the door, and the air that greeted them wasn't the stale, smoky air of a cabin. It was fresh and warm. The interior was an architectural marvel. The floors were polished slate, and the walls were lined with shelves upon shelves of hand-carved cedar. But it was the light that captured Sarah's heart. Even in the twilight, the house seemed to glow. "In the city," Caleb said, striking a match to a copper oil lamp, "people live in boxes. They shut out the world. I wanted a house that invited the mountain inside." As the lamp flickered to life, it revealed a library that rivaled the finest homes in Boston. There were books on engineering, philosophy, and botany. In the center of the room sat a drafting table covered in vellum blueprints, the same design Sarah had seen in the gold locket. The secret mansion wasn't just a house, it was a laboratory of human potential. It featured a gravity-fed water system, using the pressure from a higher spring to provide running water to a stone basin, a luxury almost unheard of in the Wyoming Territory. Sarah ran her hand over the smooth wood of a bookshelf. She looked at the man she had married, the man the world called Ragged Caleb. He stood in the center of the room, his buffalo hide coat looking out of place against the elegance of his own creation. "You didn't just rescue me from the winter, Caleb," she whispered. He looked at her, the shadows of the room softening his rugged features. "I didn't build this for me, Sarah. A house this quiet needs two voices to make it a home."
The warmth of the hearth crackled as Caleb moved through the room, lighting lamps that cast a golden hue over the cedar walls. Sarah stood in the center of the library, her fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound books. She felt as though she had stepped out of a nightmare and into a dream she wasn't yet sure she deserved. "Who are you, Caleb?" she asked softly. "Truly." Caleb paused, his silhouette tall against the massive quartz fireplace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold locket once more, laying it on the drafting table. "In another life, I was Julian Vance," he began, his voice reflecting a past he had tried to bury. "I was the lead architect for a firm in New York. I designed the iron skeletons of skyscrapers and the marble halls of the elite. I thought I was building progress, but then I saw the cost. I saw the greed, the corruption, and the way the city choked the life out of the men who built it. In the late 19th century, the Gilded Age was a period of immense wealth, but also staggering inequality and industrial grime. Many visionaries of the time grew disillusioned with the urban sprawl, leading to the Back to Nature movement. This was a philosophical shift where people believed that true human refinement could only be found by reconnecting with the wilderness. Caleb's eyes moved to the blueprints on the table. "I lost someone, Sarah. The woman in that locket. She was my wife. She died of the White Plague, tuberculosis, carried by the thick soot and crowded streets of the city. I promised her I would build a place where the air was pure. I didn't finish it in time for her. So I took my tools and my grief, and I headed west." He had spent years as a hermit, shedding the Julian the world knew to become Caleb. He had used his knowledge of structural engineering to build this sanctuary, not out of stone and mortar, but out of love and a need for redemption. He had lived in rags to save every penny for the glass and the iron he couldn't forge himself. "I didn't think I would ever share this with anyone," Caleb admitted, looking at Sarah. "But when I saw you on that platform, I saw the same look my wife had in her final days. You weren't just cold, Sarah. You were fading. I realized then that a sanctuary is a tomb if you're the only one in it." Sarah looked at the blueprints, then at the man who had traded a life of fame for a life of truth.
She realized that his poverty was his greatest strength. He had stripped away the glitter of the world to find the gold underneath. "You didn't just build a house, Caleb," Sarah whispered, stepping toward him. "You built a bridge back to life." As the first true blizzard of winter descended upon the Wind River Range, the house of stone and light stood defiant against the gale. Inside, the roar of the wind was nothing more than a faint hum against the thick quartz walls. The hearth glowed with the steady heat of seasoned mountain mahogany, a wood known for its incredible density and long-burning coal, another lesson Caleb had shared about the treasures of the high country. The winter of 1885 was recorded as one of the harshest in American history, yet for Sarah and Caleb it was a season of profound birth. In the quiet of the library, the roles of mountain man and city woman dissolved into something new. They were partners. Caleb taught Sarah how to manage the gravity-fed garden in the heated cellar, showing her how to grow winter greens using the natural warmth of the earth. In return, Sarah organized the chaos of his blueprints and journals, documenting his architectural genius for a future world that might one day value it. One evening, as the snow reached the sills of the great glass windows, Sarah sat by the fire, cradling a cup of tea made from wild rose hips, a vital source of vitamin C that kept scurvy at bay during the long frontier winters. She looked at Caleb, who was sketching a new wing for the house, a nursery. "The town still thinks you're a ghost, Caleb," she said with a smile. "They think I'm lost to the frost." Caleb set down his charcoal and looked at her, his eyes bright with a peace he hadn't known in decades. "Let them think what they wish. Wealth isn't found in what people say about you. It's found in the warmth of the room you've built and the person you share it with." They had found the ultimate redemption, the realization that the Old West wasn't just a place of struggle and survival, but a canvas for a new kind of life. They were no longer running from their pasts. They were standing on top of them, looking out over a horizon they had claimed for themselves. As the moon rose over the ridge, casting a silver glow over their hidden kingdom, Sarah knew she wasn't just rescued, she was home.
The story of Caleb and Sarah reminds us that the greatest treasures of the Old West weren't always buried in a gold mine. Sometimes they were built with bare hands and a vision for a better life. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the hidden legacy of the High Ridge. If this story of redemption touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who loves the history of the frontier. What did you think of Caleb's secret? Do you think you could leave the world behind for a life on the ridge? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge and check out our playlist for more epic tales of survival and love. Until next time, stay warm, stay brave, and may you find your own sanctuary in the wild. Be well.